There's a number of memes that are running around recently that talk about the problems DNS. DNS, or the Domain Name Service, is the name resolution process that has basically run the internet. And as long as we've had TCP/IP, DNS is the important feature to be able to allow that ability for humans to understand static names and mapping them to this very difficult world of IP address potential numbers that you're working with. I joke that with my mom, she doesn't know what my phone number is and never has. I am speed dial number 3 on her phone, and every time I change my number, I have to go to her phone and be able to change that. So as a simple example, that's DNS. If you know a name and it's static, you want to be able to map it to an IP address to support that service. And if that IP address ever changes, you don't have to change the name, it just changes the IP address resolution to that. So DNS, a foundational service, and we offer a number of them available to you inside of Azure. So let's take a look at Azure and DNS. My name is Bob Tickleman. I'm excited to be your guide for this module. I've given you a bit of a background of what DNS is going to do. It's that name to IP address resolution in what's called a forward lookup or a reverse lookup, an IP address to a name so that you could do some validation. So DNS resolutions has typically been done for many years where you would have to build DNS servers, you'd have to configure the service, and then manage all those resources. Now, some of this is going to be taken over for you, so we're going to take a look at what is DNS and how you can use an Azure service to actually host your DNS services. Now, one of the nice things about Azure is in the past, for high availability, you would have to have multiple DNS servers. And you would have to then manage multiple servers and maintain them and patch them. As a platform, as a service, it's now going to be available to you to actually have this be managed at the size and scale of Azure. So we'll take a look at how to build DNS at both a public and a private name resolution process. Now, without getting into it right now and too deeply, we also had a potential problem that what happens to my external namespace versus my internal namespace. So maybe what you have is a public namespace that you've been using that people get access to your public website that they know your organization through. Well, that's great, but what happens if you have an internal name structure that you're working with that you use for your internal resources, your internal services that you're making available to your employees? Well, you need DNS to do that. What happens if you had the same namespace internally as you had externally? And we often talked about what's called split brain. So some of this is going to be made available to you in a much simpler manner to actually take a look at your namespaces and potentially collapse some of them to make them a little bit easier to manage. So if you have a public namespace, in this case contoso.com possibly, you would have to go to a name registrar to make sure that it's available, and then you would register that name. You would then have to give it your name resolution servers, and this goes back to you would then have to build these servers. By registering this with your Azure service for DNS, it's automatically going to create a default set of 4 name servers that you could then configure and use for your name resolution. Now, this is all backed by Azure and the high availability capabilities that we've talked about in numerous recordings in this series. And so what you now have is the capability of taking these DNS servers and then populate them with the standard records of your A records, your C name records, all of those, your TXT records, your MX records that you might have. We're not going to get into all of the DNS configurations. That would be done in a different recording, not part of this series. But, understanding DNS, but this is basically a like for like replacement of your ability to have to deploy and maintain your DNS servers in a physical or virtual environment. This is a service. We'll be doing some of this in a hands-on experience in a bit, where we're going to go in and configure DNS and we'll have it do our public name resolution capabilities. As I said, what is DNS? Now, it falls into these 2 categories of what's called a forward lookup, where it takes a name and resolves it to a potentially dynamic changing IP address. So it's an IP address that you put in that says, if you give me this name, www.tickleman.com, it's then going to go to that address that hosts the www service or your World Wide Web service on that server, which might be different than mail.tickleman.com, which is going to go to your mail systems that you're working with. And it's going to route that traffic for you. So it's going to manage the allocation of resources accessed by some kind of common name that you're working with. Creating these public DNS zones, this is that public name record that we're talking about, and we have the different types of records that you're dealing with. You see the full range of them here. I've mentioned a number of them. Now, depending on whether you're using IPv4, an A record versus an IPv6 is the quad A records you're dealing with. We're not getting into that level of detail in here, but we have the full management capabilities. Now, this is in that forward lookup capability. I mentioned you might also want a reverse lookup capability, which you're going to be able to work with as well. Once you've registered your name, you've got it identified that you can own that name, there's going to be a validation process that will show you that you could now say, I want to prove that I own this name so that I could do DNS resolution. And I'm going to then show you how you can actually use that at your Azure tenant as well for the tenant registration and access to the resources on the tenant instead of using that on Microsoft.com name. Now, I mentioned the private DNS, and this goes back to that public-private split brain scenario that we had in the past. We are going to be able to use DNS internally to our resources in a private DNS zone as well. Now, in other recordings, I've talked about the subnets and some of the ways that they work, and I just want to go there for a second. So I've got my public DNS that we have for Contoso.com that will go to, in this case, 10.2.1.50/24. So if something hits www in an A record.contoso.com, it's going to DNS resolve that. So I've got some person sitting on a laptop. They're going to www.contoso.com. I'm not going to go through all the name resolutions of finding your namespace, but it finds this. It then gets the resolution to actually come to a server that is sitting here at 10.2.1.50. We talked about some of the capabilities of the VNet and the subnets we're taking a look at. We saw that the first three records that are available, in my case, 1, 2, and 3. Remember, they're not always those specific numbers. 1 was used for the resolution of the default gateway, and the next two numbers were used for a private DNS that you could use for managing internal to your network system. And so we have these private DNS capabilities built into Azure and its networking services that could be similar or different from your public names resolutions that you're working with. So this is what they're talking about back on that slide, is the private DNS capabilities available for us to also provide name resolution for us. And it also makes that simpler for that split brain, because you can identify, is this going to be used for internal use, or is it going to be used to address information from a public space? So you don't have to manage that distinction. So let's go into an example of creating that public name records. I'm also going to add a little bit where I'm going to show it how it was used to validate, and I could then use it in my Entra ID as a namespace I could then use for my user accounts. And then we'll take a look at creating some records. So I want to do something that's DNS related, but not specifically to what we're just talking about. And I'm going to show you how to register a DNS name that you publicly own so that it could then be assigned to your tenant information and used inside of your tenant. If you saw in another recording when we talked about user accounts and governance, we talked about a default name of something.onmicrosoft.com, which all tenants get. So I want to give you that as an example, maybe clear up some issues, and then we'll go take a look at the DNS features specifically. So I'm in my specific tenant, which is the tickleman.com name. You'll see that up here in the upper right-hand corner. Now, normally it has a long name, but I've been able to prove that I own that name, and it's now coming up as my tenant information. So I'm actually going to come into Microsoft Entra ID. I'm going to come down into custom domain names. And you'll see that what I've done here is I've been able to register multiple names to this single tenant. I've been able to validate through a process where I say I want tickleman.com. It says, go put this record, either an MX record or a TXT record, into your SOA, your start of authority. So whoever's authoritative for this, if you put this value there, we're going to go check that and see if it's there. If so, you've been able to prove to us that you own that name. So you can see I've been able to validate a few. There's tickleman.com. There's a good friend of mine, Bruce Hewer. I've got their name as well. And I've got one here, EIEIO. I haven't been able to verify that because guess what? I don't own it. But there's the example of the information that if I were to be able to put that into the SOA record, I would be able to validate and own that component. And you're seeing the default names that came up with tickleman.onmicrosoft.com. And that's what used to appear in the upper right-hand corner. That's how everybody would have their email addresses. So when you take a look at identities and the users that we all covered this in another recording, you can see that people now have the UPN or user principal name of their domain name, as opposed to in the past, if you saw that recording on user accounts, they all ended up at onmicrosoft.com or the tenant name on Microsoft.com. So there's a DNS piece right there for you. Now we're going to go in and take a look at the different types of DNS that we just mentioned. Now I've created a few of them already and I just want to use them to demonstrate, to show, but I'm coming in, I'm going to take a look at DNS, and you can see that there's a number of services that I can work with. There's the Enter ID features of DNS, some of the ones I was just talking about. We have DNS zones, and again, that name, if you're familiar with DNS, you have a zone or a namespace. So for every namespace, in my past example, Tickleman, Hewer, Bismail, the three domain zones that I had a zone for them, all on the same servers, but 3 different zones. In that namespace, I would then create a set of records. We're going to take a look at this private DNS that we just talked about as well, and we'll come in and how we could use that to replace the private DNS that was there by default when you build Azure VNets that has in the subnets. Remember, the first record is going to be used for the default gateway, and then there's 2 addresses that are going to be used for DNS inside by default. You could replace that with your own private DNS resolvers that you could configure. So I'm going to go in and create a DNS zone. And it's pretty straightforward. You're going to have a subscription and a resource group that you want to give it. And then what is the zone name that you want to put in? Now I could put in Contoso, but it's going to bark at me because it says that's a reserved name. So I could come up with some variation of that, of say something like RJBT Contoso.com. And there's not a lot that I can actually do. Now, at this moment in time, it allows me to upload a zone file. So if you're going from an on-premises or a privately held DNS server, you could export that zone information and import it here. So maybe you've got hundreds of records for all the internal servers that you've got. You know, you could actually import that information. And it's just a review and create. So there's not a lot of configuration. But once the zone is created, I'm going to cancel out of here. What I then have is the ability to come in and actually manage the record sets. And this is what we were talking about back in the slides that I was showing you. So you can get that SOA, or the start of authority record, and you can see what our name servers are. So those are the 4 name servers that come up that I could then use. And if I go to the registrar of where I registered this name, I could then give it these name servers so that when anybody looks up that name, they will come to this location as an Azure service. It would then point to this DNS zone, and this is where I could start putting in all the different types of records that I would need that we were showing you back at the slide. So pretty simple. DNS is pretty straightforward. Now the other one that I wanted to show you was the private DNS. Very similar to what we're just dealing with. So the private resolvers, I can now create, give it a name, and which virtual networks do I want to apply this? Because remember, virtual networks are going to have that default in their subnets. What is going to happen to all the subnets in that VNet? They're going to have DNS, 2 DNS servers. I could now replace that with a private DNS that I create versus having the system pick it up on a per VNet basis. So this way you can build it at an enterprise level and have it deployed across all the VNets, or maybe you have one for dev, one for test, one for production. So I've got 3 different DNSs. As I build those resources through a template, I could now have them have a common DNS resolution across all the VNets that are going to be used for that solution you're working with. So you have your inbound endpoints, your outbound endpoints that you have that are going to be able to connect to those services. So a pretty simple demonstration. DNS is a pretty simple service, but so important for us to be able to work with. Let's go back to the presentation. DNS is a simple service, but it's critical to the communications and people's ability to use common names that are easy to remember and map it to the complex network infrastructure that you're working with. We see that Azure provides, at the size and scale of Azure, reliable services that you can now replace your existing DNS infrastructure with. And we also overlay that with a separate DNS service that is built into the virtual networking inside of Azure. And we can now pair the private DNS environment for our internal resources and map it and work with a public name resolution using those two services within inside of Azure. Thanks for joining us for this session. To continue your learning, watch other videos in the course or explore more on Microsoft Learn at aka.ms/learn.